In the 9th year of the reign of Xerxes, king of kings, ruler of an empire that stretched from the Iron Sea to the borders of India, a girl named Amidas celebrated her 13th birthday in the women's quarters of the palace at Pepilolis. She wore silk, dyed with Tyrian purple, the color reserved for royalty. Gold bands circled her wrists and ankles. Her dark hair had been arranged by palace servants into elaborate braids, decorated with pearls brought from the Persian Gulf. She looked by every external measure like what she was, a princess of the most powerful empire on earth, daughter of the great king himself, blessed with every luxury and privilege that royal birth could provide. But Amitas was not celebrating. She sat on cushions in her chamber, hands trembling in her lap, trying to control her breathing, while her mother, one of Xerxes' secondary wives, applied cosmetics to her face with a precision that suggested ritual rather than beauty. Kohl around the eyes, carefully drawn to make them seem larger, rouge on the lips and cheeks to create the appearance of health and excitement, perfumed oil on her neck and wrists, the scent heavy and cloying, making Amit Midas feel slightly sick. Her mother worked in silence, her own hands shaking slightly, her face carefully neutral in the way that palace women learn to maintain when experiencing emotions they dared not express. When the cosmetics were complete, her mother stepped back and looked at Amitas with eyes that seemed to be memorizing every detail. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, the words coming slowly as if each one required physical effort to produce. Tonight, your father will summon you. You will go to his chambers. You will do whatever he requires. You will show no fear, no resistance, no emotion except gratitude for his attention. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Amitas nodded, though she didn't fully understand, though her body knew something terrible was approaching. Even if her mind couldn't yet grasp what her mother's words actually meant. She had grown up in the palace, had seen how the Harem women lived, had understood in the abstract that they existed to serve her father's pleasure. But she was his daughter. Surely that made her different. Surely that protected her from the uses to which other women were put. Surely her father saw her as a child, not as another body available for his consumption. Her mother saw the confusion and the dawning horror in Amidas's face, and something in her own expression cracked for just a moment before she regained control. You are the king's daughter, she said, her voice now utterly flat, drained of all feeling. But you are also the king's property. Your body belongs to him. Your life belongs to him. Your purpose is prosed, whatever he decides it to be. He brought you into this world. He can use you however he wishes. That is the reality. You must accept, if you want to survive, what comes next. Before Idas could respond, before she could ask the presented questions that were forming in her throat, but that seemed too terrible to speak aloud, the chamber door opened and a eunuch entered. He was one of the senior eunuchs, a man Amit Midas had known her entire life, who had sometimes brought her gifts on festival days when she was younger. But now he looked at her with eyes that held no warmth, no recognition of their previous relationship, only the flat assessment of someone evaluating property for fitness to purpose. The king summons his daughter Amitas, the eunuch said, his high voice carrying no emotion. She will come immediately. Her mother will not accompany her. She will not speak unless the king addresses her directly. She will obey all commands without hesitation. These instructions are clear. Amidas stood on legs that felt disconnected from her body, looking one last time at her mother, who could not meet her eyes, could not offer comfort or protection, could only watch as her 3-year-old daughter was taken to serve the king, who was simultaneously her father and her master. The eunuch gestured toward the door, and Amytas followed, because refusing was unthinkable, because her entire life had taught her that obedience was the only possible response to royal command. Because some part of her still couldn't quite believe what was about to happen, and hoped desperately that she had misunderstood her mother's warning. But she had not misunderstood what happened to Amytas that night in her father's chambers. What Xerxes did to his own 3-year-old daughter, in acts that he understood as demonstrations of his absolute power and divine right, was something that she would never speak of to anyone for the rest of her life. Something that would mark her so deeply that even decades later, when she was an old woman living in obscurity in a remote corner of the empire, she would sometimes wake from nightmares, reliving that first night and all the nights that followed. But before I tell you the full horror of what Xerxes did to Amytas and to his other daughters, before I reveal the systematic way he used his own children as instruments for his pleasure and his political purposes, before I explain how this practice was not hidden or secret, but was known throughout the Christians' empire, and was accepted as normal by a society that had granted kings godlike authority over everyone, including their own families, I need to tell you who Xerxes was, how he came to power, what kind of man could treat his daughters this way, and how the Persian system created conditions where such actions seem not monstrous, but natural to those in power. Subscribe to this channel right now, because what you're about to learn goes beyond ancient history into territory that reveals how absolute power corrupts absolutely, how societies can normalize the unspeakable when it serves the interests of elites, how family bonds mean nothing when power dynamics are extreme enough. This is not a story about a single monster, but about a system that produced monsters and called them gods. Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments what you know about Xerxes in ancient Persia, because I guarantee what you're about to discover will shock you, even if you think you know this history. Now, let me take you back to how Xerxes became the man who would use his daughters the way other men used palace slaves, and how Persian culture created the framework that made such actions possible. Xerxes was born in 518 BCE, the son of Darius the Great and Queen Atassa, daughter of Cyrus the Great, who had founded the Persian Empire. His bloodline was impeccable, descended from the two most important Persian rulers, combining legitimacy from both lines, positioned from birth to inherit the greatest empire the world had ever known. But Xerxes was not Darius's firstborn son. He had older half-bros from his fathers, other wives, and Persian succession was not absolutely guaranteed to pass to the eldest son. It passed to the son who could most successfully claim divine favor and practical capability. Darius had established his reign through military conquest and administrative genius, transforming the Persian Empire from a collection of conquered territories into a sophisticated administrative state with roads, postal systems, standardized coinage, and legal codes that govern millions of people across thousands of miles. He had secured the empire's borders, crushing rebellions and expanding Persian control into new territories. He had built the magnificent palace complex at Prosopolis, creating a physical symbol of Persian power and wealth, announced to the world that the Persian king stood above all other rulers. But Darius had also failed spectacularly in his attempt to conquer Greece. Defeated at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE by Greek hoplites, who proved that Persian military dominance was not absolute. This failure created a succession crisis, because it raised questions about divine favor. If the gods truly supported Darius and the presented based Persian royal family, how could the Greeks have defeated them? Xerxes, competing with his half-bros for succession, needed to demonstrate that the gods favored him, specifically, that he would restore Persian prestige, that he would complete his father's unfinished business. When Darius died in prestige, 486 B.C.E., Xerxes prevailed in the succession struggle, partly through his mother's superior lineage. Attis's connection to Cyrus the Great made her son the most legitimate heir, but also through ruthless elimination of rivals. His half-brothers who challenged his claim met mysterious ends or were forced into positions where they could not effectively compete. The official records called these deaths accidents or divine judgments. The reality was that Xerxes and his supporters orchestrated the removal of anyone who threatened his path to absolute power. Once securely established as King of Kings, Xerxes began planning the campaign that would define his reign, the invasion of Greece that would avenge his father's defeat and demonstrate Persian supremacy. He spent 4 years preparing, assembling the largest military force the ancient world had ever seen, building bridges across the Hellespont to move his province army from Asia into Europe, organizing supply lines that would sustain hundreds of thousands of soldiers on campaign. The scale of preparation was staggering, mobilizing resources from across the stacked empire, demanding tribute and troops from subject peoples, creating an expedition that would either secure Xerxes' reputation as the greatest king in history or destroy it completely. During these years of preparation, Xerxes was in his late 22nd and early 32nd, young for a Persian king, vigorous, confident in his power and his divine mandate. He had inherited his father's harem, hundreds of women who had served Darius and who now served his son. He had also begun accumulating his own harem, taking women who caught his eye, accepting daughters from nobles seeking favor, collecting beautiful captives from his military campaigns. The Harem. By 480 B.C.E., when the Greek invasion began, numbered over 600 women, according to Greek sources, though that number may be exaggerated. But Xerxes did not limit himself to the women who had been brought to his harem from outside. He also claimed his own daughters as they reached puberty, bringing them into his chambers, using their bodies for his pleasure, treating them identically to how he treated slaves or captives, or tribute offerings from subject peoples. This practice, a father using his daughters for intimate purposes, was not unique to Xerxes in ancient Persian royal culture, but he practiced it more systematically and more openly than previous kings, and his treatment of his procket daughters became notorious even in an empire that generally tolerated whatever kings chose to do. Let me tell you about how this practice developed in Persian royal culture, because understanding the cultural context helps us grasp how something that seems incomprehensible to modern minds seemed normal or at least acceptable to ancient Persians. Persian kings claimed descent from the gods, specifically from Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of Zoroastrian religion that had become the official faith of the Persian Empire. This divine ancestry meant that royal blood was qualitatively different from common blood, was sacred and powerful, carried divine essence that needed to be preserved and concentrated. The logical conclusion from this belief was that the purest royal bloodlines came from unions between people who both possessed this divine blood. Siblings marrying, siblings, parents and children, producing offspring together, keeping the sacred essence within the smallest possible circle. Egyptian pharaohs had practiced similar logic with sibling marriage, and Persian kings borrowed or independently developed comparable practices. But Persian kings went further than Egyptians, in some ways claiming not just the right, but the obligation to unite with any woman who carried royal blood, including their own daughters, because doing so concentrated divine essence and produced children of maximum divine purity. The religious framework justified the practice. The practical reality was that it served the king's desires and reinforced his absolute power by demonstrating that literally no one was beyond his reach, that even the most intimate family bonds meant nothing in the face of royal authority that fathers could use daughters the same way they used any other property, because royal fathers were not really fathers in the normal sense, but were gods, or god representatives, whose relationships with their children were fundamentally different from normal human family relationships. By the time Xerxes reached full maturity and began actively using this justification to claim his daughters, the practice had been established for several generations and was discussed openly in the court without apparent shame or secrecy. Greek historians who wrote about Xerxes, men like Herodotus who interviewed Persian sources, or who heard stories from Greeks who had interacted with the Persian court, recorded these practices with fascination and horror, seeing them as evidence of Persian decadence and tyranny. But to Persians, or at least to the Persian elite who benefited from royal power, Xerxes was simply exercising prerogatives that came with his divine status. Now, let me tell you what this meant in practice, what it meant for the daughters who were born into the royal family, and who grew up knowing that their father would eventually claim them once they reached the age he found desirable. Let me tell you about the psychological torture of being raised as a princess with every luxury, but knowing that luxury came with a price that would be extracted when you reached puberty. Xerxes had numerous daughters from his various wives and concubines. The sources don't agree on exact numbers, but suggest he had at least 15 daughters who survived infancy and reached adolescence. These girls were raised in the women's quarters of the palace, educated by tutors in reading and writing, trained in music and dance, taught to manage servants and conduct themselves with the dignity appropriate to their royal status. They wore the finest clothing. They ate the best food. They were protected from every hardship that ordinary Persian children faced. They lived in luxury that most people in the empire couldn't imagine. But they also grew up watching older daughters disappear from the women's quarters when they reached puberty, taken to their father's chambers, returning hours or days later with something broken in their eyes, never speaking about what had happened, but carrying themselves differently afterward, as if they had learned something about the world and about their place in it that had destroyed some essential innocence. The younger daughters watched this pattern repeat, saw their older sisters transform from girls into something else, understood without being told explicitly that the same transformation awaited them. Some mothers tried to protect their daughters by preparing them psychologically, explaining in careful language what would be required, teaching them to dissociate during the experience, giving them herbs that would dull sensation or awareness. Other mothers said nothing, hoping perhaps that ignorance would somehow make the experience less traumatic, or simply unable to find words for what their daughters would experience. But regardless of whether mothers tried to prepare their daughters or remain silent, the daughters knew. They saw the patterns. They understood what was coming. The day a daughter was first summoned by Xerxes followed a ritual pattern. She would be bathed elaborately by female servants, her body scrubbed until skin glowed, every trace of body hair removed, perfumed oils applied liberally. Her hair would be arranged in styles that the king preferred. Cosmetics would be applied to make her appear older and more developed than her actual age. She would be dressed in clothing that revealed more than it concealed. Then a eunuch would come to collect her, and she would be taken through the palace corridors to the king's private chambers. Knowing that her childhood was ending, that what happened next would define her relationship with her father for the rest of her life. What happened in those chambers varied depending on the king's mood and the particular daughter involved. But the fundamental reality was always the same. A 13 or 14-year-old girl alone with her father, who had absolute power over her, who saw her not primarily as his daughter, but as another beautiful body available for his use, who felt no shame or hesitation treating her the way he treated his concubines, because his divine status meant normal human boundaries and taboos simply didn't apply to him. Some daughters were summoned repeatedly over months or years, becoming regular features in their father's rotation of available women, expected to present themselves whenever called, and to perform whatever services he required. Other daughters were summoned only once or a few times, either because they failed to please the king sufficiently, or because he lost interest in them as newer options became available. But, whether summoned frequently or rarely, every daughter who experienced even one such encounter was marked by it, carried the knowledge of what her father had done and what she had been powerless to prevent. Let me tell you about Art Taint, one of Xerxes' daughters, who became caught in a scandal that revealed to the wider empire what usually remained confined within palace walls. Her story, recorded by Herodotus and other Greek historians, illustrates both how these practices operated and what happened when they became too visible, or when they threatened the stability of royal power. Our Taint was perhaps 15 or 16 when she caught the attention not of her father, but of his brother-in-law, a Persian noble named Xerxes, who held a high command in the military, and who was married to Xerxes' sister. Our Taint and Mists fell into some kind of relationship. The sources disagree about whether it was romantic or simply friendly that violated the absolute rule that royal daughters belonged exclusively to their father, until he chose to dispose of them through marriage to other nobles. When Xerxes discovered this relationship, his response revealed the deadly dynamics of royal power and family bonds twisted by the harem system. He did not punish Our Taint directly. That would have required acknowledging that his daughter had agency enough to choose a relationship which would have undermined his claim of absolute ownership. Instead, he punished Mrs., his wife, his own sister, having her mutilated in ways that ancient sources describe with horror, her breasts and nose and ears cut off, her tongue removed, her body destroyed as punishment for her husband's transgression, and as a warning about what happened when anyone interfered with the king's property. As for Our Taint herself, she disappeared from the historical record after this incident. Whether she was executed, imprisoned, married off to remove her from the court, or simply continued living in the harem under stricter supervision, the sources don't specify. But her disappearance demonstrates that even being the king's daughter provided no real protection when royal power felt threatened. That family connection meant nothing when set against the king's determination to maintain absolute control over everyone, including his children. The mutilation of Mrs.'s wife, while Art vanished, reveals the fundamental principle of Xerxes' treatment of his family. Men who crossed him were punished through the women connected to them, and women who crossed him simply ceased to exist in ways that left no visible record. The system was designed to terrify without creating martyrs, to punish without generating sympathy, to maintain control through demonstrated willingness to destroy anyone, regardless of family bonds or previous favor. Now, let me tell you about what happened during Xerxes' Greek campaign. Because this military expedition created circumstances where his treatment of his daughters became even more systematic and more instrumental, as he used them as tools for maintaining army morale and for rewarding loyal commanders. The invasion of Greece that Xerxes launched in 480 B.C.E. was the largest military expedition the ancient world had ever seen. Ancient sources claim he brought over 1 million soldiers, though modern historians consider that number exaggerated and estimate the actual force at perhaps 200,000 or more. Regardless of the exact count, this was an enormous army drawn from dozens of ethnic groups across the empire, requiring complex logistics and constant attention to morale and unity. Xerxes brought his harem with him on campaign. Not all 600 women, that would have been impossible logistically, but several dozen of his favorites, and significantly, several of his daughters. The sources specifically mention that royal princesses accompanied the army, traveling in covered wagons guarded by different eunuchs, maintained in the luxury and isolation appropriate to their status, even while on military campaign. The official explanation for bringing these women was that the king needed access to comfort and pleasure even during war, that his divine status required him to maintain his usual lifestyle, regardless of circumstances. But there was also a practical political purpose. The women, particularly the daughters, could be used as rewards or incentives for commanders who performed well or who needed to be bound more tightly to Xerxes' interests. When a general won an important victory or accomplished a difficult objective, Xerxes would sometimes reward him by allowing him to marry one of the royal princesses who traveled with the army. This was an enormous honor. Marriage to a king's daughter elevated a man's status dramatically, connected him to the royal family, gave his children royal blood that could potentially be leveraged for power. But it also meant that Xerxes' daughters were being distributed as political tools, married off to men decades older than themselves, sent away from the only life they had known to live with strangers, who had been given them as rewards for service to their father. For the daughters, these marriages meant escape from their father's chamber, but also meant being given to men who understood them as prizes rather than as people, who had been rewarded with their bodies and their reproductive capacity, who would use them for pleasure and for producing children who could claim some royal blood. The daughters had no choice. In these marriages, no ability to refuse or negotiate. They were simply informed that they had been given to a particular commander and that they would now be his wife, and they were expected to accept this decision with gratitude for being used in ways that served the empire's interests. Let me tell you about a specific case that illuminates this practice. A general named Megabis distinguished himself during the invasion, commanding forces with skill and demonstrating loyalty during periods when other commanders wavered. Xerxes rewarded Megabius by giving him the princess Amidas. Not the same Amidas I described at the opening, but another daughter bearing that name, perhaps 14 or 15 years old when the marriage was arranged. The marriage was celebrated with elaborate ceremony during a pause in the campaign. Amidas was dressed in bridal finery, paraded before assembled troops as visual demonstration of the Inu said rewards that came from serving the king well, then handed over to Megabius, who was twice her age, and who she had met perhaps once or twice before the wedding. She traveled with him thereafter as his wife, bearing him children in subsequent years, living apparently successfully within the constraints of this arranged marriage. But we should not mistake survival for happiness or acceptance. Amidas had been given no choice about this marriage, had been removed from her mother and sisters, had been handed to a stranger as payment for military service, that she apparently made the best of this situation, that she fulfilled her duties as a general's wife, that she produced the children expected of her. None of this means she wanted this life or that. Being given as a reward was anything other than another form of being used by her father for purposes that served his interests rather than hers. The Greek campaign ultimately failed despite the enormous resources Xerxes invested in it. His forces won initial victories including the famous stand at Thermopylae, where a small Greek force held a narrow pass for days before being overwhelmed. His troops captured and burned Athens, destroying temples and demonstrating Persian power. But the Greek naval victory at Salamis and the subsequent land defeat at Plataea broke the invasion's momentum and forced Xerxes to retreat back to Asia, having failed to achieve his objective of subjugating Greece. This failure had profound consequences for Xerxes personally and for how he treated his family afterward. Let me tell you about what happened when Xerxes returned to Prosopilis defeated, how his humiliation transformed into increased cruelty toward those he could control, even as he had failed to control his enemies. The defeat in Greece damaged Xerxes's prestige and raised questions about divine favor. If he was truly the god king he claimed to be, blessed by Ahura Mazda, destined to rule the world, how could he have been defeated by the Greeks, who were fractious and disorganized, and possessed only a fraction of Persian resources? The failure created political vulnerability, encouraged potential rivals, and made Xerxes paranoid about loyalty and about challenges to his authority. He responded to this paranoia by tightening control over the court, eliminating anyone suspected of disloyalty or ambition, and demonstrating his power in ways that could not be questioned or resisted. His harem became a primary arena for these demonstrations, because exerting total control over women who could not resist was one way to reassure himself that he still possessed absolute power, even if he had failed to exercise that power successfully against external enemies. His daughters bore the brunt of this increased need for control and domination. Those who had traveled with him on campaign and who had not been married off as rewards were summoned more frequently to his chambers after the return to Persia. New daughters who reached puberty during or after the Greek campaign were initiated earlier, and more brutally than previous daughters had been. The king's use of his daughters became more systematic and more openly discussed in the court, as if Xerxes was daring anyone to question his right to do as he wished with his own family. But I need to tell you about another daughter, one whose story reveals the full horror of how Xerxes' treatment of his children combined familial power with political calculation in ways that destroyed lives, while serving what he considered state interests. Her name was a mistress, again a common royal name that appears for multiple women. And she was perhaps 12 years old when Xerxes decided to use her in a scheme that would demonstrate both his creativity in political manipulation and his complete disregard for his daughter's well-being. There was a Persian noble named Artabanus, who commanded the royal bodyguard and who had enormous influence at court because he controlled access to the king and because he commanded the troops who physically protected royal power. Artabanus was loyal and competent, but Xerxes worried about what would happen if this loyalty ever wavered. If Artabanus decided to support a rival or to make himself king, the man who controlled the royal bodyguard could kill the king and make it seem like an accident or a defensive response to imagined threat. Xerxes decided to bind Artabanus more tightly to royal interests by offering him something that would make betrayal unthinkable, with a marriage to the princess Amstrus, who was 12, which would make Artabanus the king's son-in-law, and which would give any children from this marriage royal blood that could potentially be leveraged for succession if circumstances changed. This was an enormous honor that Artabanus could not refuse without insulting the king, and it created a bond that made betrayal more complicated because betraying the king would mean destroying his own wife's father. But before giving Amstrus to Artabanus in marriage, Xerxes summoned her to his own chambers repeatedly over several months, using her in ways that fathers should not use daughters. impregnating her with his own child. Then when she was visibly pregnant, he arranged the marriage to Artabanus, presenting this pregnant 2-year-old to his bodyguard commander as a wife, forcing Artabanus to accept a bride who was carrying the king's child, creating a situation where Artabanus would have to raise as his own son a boy who was actually his wife's half-brother and the king's grandson. The political calculation was sophisticated and cruel. Artabanus was now bound to Xerxes through multiple overlapping connections. He was son-in-law. He was raising the king's child as his own. He was deeply complicit in a situation that he could never discuss openly, because doing so would acknowledge what the king had done. If Artabanus ever moved against Xerxes, the king could reveal the truth about the child, destroying Artabanus's reputation and legitimacy. If Artabanus remained loyal, he would spend his life raising a child who represented his own humiliation and subordination. For a mistress, the situation was catastrophic. She had been used by her father and then given to a man who would always see her as both a prize from the king and as evidence of his own powerlessness to refuse royal commands. She would bear a child whose parentage was a lie she would have to maintain for life. She would live with a husband who could never truly trust or love her because she represented his forced complicity in the king's schemes. Her entire life had been orchestrated to serve her father's political interests, and she had no agency in any of it. The marriage apparently persisted for years, and the child, a boy, grew up believing Artabanus was his father. Whether Amstress ever told her son the truth, whether Artabanus eventually revealed it, whether the truth remained hidden through Amstress's entire life, the sources don't specify. But the fact that Xerxes was willing to do this to his own 2-year-old daughter, to impregnate her, and then hand her to another man, to maintain political control, reveals the absolute depths of how royal power could corrupt family bonds and how little daughters' well-being mattered when set against political calculation. Now, let me tell you about the succession crisis that occurred after Xerxes' death, because this is where his treatment of Contine. His daughters came back to have terrible consequences for the women who had suffered under his rule. What Xerxes had normalized, using daughters as instruments, treating them as property without agency, created precedents that his sons followed, leading to systematic destruction of royal women during the violent power struggles that followed his assassination. Xerxes ruled for 21 years after the failed Greek invasion, from 486 to 465 BCE. The later years of his reign were characterized by building projects. He completed construction at Pipolis, adding elaborate reliefs and structures that celebrated Persian power, and by increasing withdrawal into palace life and harem pleasures. He seems to have lost interest in active military campaigns after the Greek failure, preferring to manage the empire through in-number subordinates, while he focused on personal comfort and on demonstrating his power through control of the court, rather than through external conquest. His relationship with his sons became strained during these later years. He had numerous sons from various wives, and they competed for his favor and for positioning as likely heir. The official heir was Darius, his eldest son by Queen Astrus, not the daughter Astrus, but Xerxes' principal wife, who bore the same name. But Xerxes had other sons who believed they had better claims or who simply wanted power, regardless of legitimacy. In 465 BCE, Xerxes was assassinated in his bedchamber by a conspiracy involving Artabanus, the same commander who had been given the 2-year-old pregnant Astrus years earlier, and others at court who had decided that Xerxes needed to be removed. The official story was confused and contradictory with various sources, blaming different conspirators. But the result was clear. Xerxes was killed and a succession crisis immediately erupted as his sons fought to claim the throne. Xerxes, one of Xerxes' younger sons, emerged victorious from this struggle, killing his brothers or forcing them into exile, establishing himself as the new king of kings. And in the process of consolidating power, he systematically eliminated threats to his rule, including threats represented by his own sisters, Xerxes' daughters, who were now women in their 22nd and 32nd. Many married to powerful nobles, some with children who could potentially claim royal blood and challenge Artaxerxes' legitimacy. The massacre that followed was methodical and brutal. Xerxes ordered the execution or imprisonment of sisters who were married to men he considered disloyal, potentially dangerous. He forced other sisters to divorce their husbands and to marry men who supported Artaxerxes, using his sisters as rewards for loyalty, exactly as Xerxes had used his daughters. He confiscated property from sisters he suspected of supporting rival brothers. He sent some sisters into internal exile in remote parts of the Plus Empire, where they could be monitored and prevented from causing trouble. Some of Xerxes' daughters died during this purge. Some disappeared from historical records, their fates unknown but probably terrible. Some survived by making themselves useful to the new king, by betraying their former husbands or their children, by demonstrating loyalty to Artaxerxes at the cost of every other bond and principle. The women who had already been victimized by their father's treatment discovered that their suffering did not end with his death, but continued as they became pawns in their brother's struggle to consolidate power. Let me tell you about what happened to Amytas, the daughter I described at the very beginning, the 3-year-old who had been summoned to her father's chambers and who had experienced that first terrible night that marked her for life. She survived Xerxes' assassination and the succession crisis that followed. She was married by Artaxerxes to a Persian noble named Megabyzus, not the same general mentioned earlier, but a man bearing the same name which was common in Persian aristocracy, who commanded frontier forces and who Artaxerxes wanted to ensure remained loyal. Amytas was perhaps 25 when this marriage was arranged, had already been used by her father for years, was being given to yet another man as a political tool. She bore Megabyzus' children, managed his household, fulfilled all the duties expected of a noble's wife. But according to fragmentary sources, she also maintained contacts with other royal women who had survived the purge, creating networks of mutual support among women who shared the experience of being used as instruments by the men in their family. These networks were dangerous because they represented women acting with agency, making choices about who to trust and who to support, potentially collaborating in ways that served their own interests rather than simply accepting whatever men decided. The eunuchs who managed the Harem system watched these networks carefully, reporting to Artaxerxes about which women were forming alliances, which conversations seemed to have political content, which relationships might represent organizing against royal control. Eventually, Artaxerxes decided that Amytas had become too independent, was maintaining too many contacts with potentially disloyal elements, represented a threat that needed to be neutralized. He didn't execute her. That would have been visible and would have upset Megabyzus, whose loyalty was still valuable. Instead, he used more subtle methods to destroy her influence and her concession networks. Amytas' children were taken from her, sent to be raised in the palace where they would be educated in proper loyalty, and where their mother couldn't influence their development. Her correspondence was monitored with letters intercepted and read before being delivered, making private communication impossible. Her movements were restricted with guards assigned to accompany her whenever she left her residence, preventing unauthorized meetings. Her contacts with other royal women were gradually severed through similar restrictions applied to them, isolating each woman so that networks couldn't function, even if individual women wanted to maintain them. This isolation applied to a woman who had already spent her childhood knowing she would be used by her father, who had promised, endured years of being summoned to his chambers, who had been married off as a political tool, who had tried to find some agency and solidarity with other women in similar situations. This final isolation broke something in Midas that even her father's abuse had not quite managed to break. She became withdrawn and depressed, stopped eating properly, stopped maintaining her appearance, stopped engaging with the world around her. She died at age 33, officially from illness, but more accurately, from the accumulated psychological destruction of a life spent being used by her father and then by her brother, never having meaningful choice or agency, always being property that served others' interests rather than a person with value and rights of her own. Her death was barely noted in court records. No elaborate funeral was held. Her children, being raised in the palace, were told their mother had died, but were discouraged from mourning her too openly, because excessive attachment to openly family members outside the immediate royal line was considered suspect. This was the typical trajectory for Xerxes' daughters who survived him. A childhood spent knowing they would be used by their father, the grassed far, the down years of actually being used, marriages arranged to serve political purposes, continued use by brothers or husbands as instruments of policy, gradual isolation if they showed any signs of independence, and deaths that came either from violence during succession struggles or from the slower destruction of psychological abuse that accumulated over decades until it killed them just as surely as poison or blades would have. Now, let me tell you about how this system was understood by the broader Persian society, because understanding contemporary reactions helps us see that not everyone accepted these practices as normal or acceptable even within Persian culture itself. There were critics, voices that suggested what Xerxes did to his daughters went too far even by Persian standards of royal prerogative. The Zoroastrian priests, who were the religious authorities in Persian society, held complex positions regarding royal treatment of daughters. On one hand, Zoroastrian theology emphasized purity and the importance of maintaining clean bloodlines, which could be interpreted as supporting royal incest as a way of keeping divine blood concentrated. On the other hand, Zoroastrian ethical teachings emphasized truth and righteousness and proper family relationships, and some priests argued that fathers using daughters violated fundamental moral principles that should apply even to kings. These priestly critics couldn't speak too openly because challenging the king directly was dangerous, but they could preach sermons about proper family relationships without naming Xerxes specifically. They could emphasize Zoroastrian teachings about the importance of protecting children and about how power should be exercised righteously rather than purely for pleasure. They could tell stories from religious texts about rulers who had fallen from grace by violating moral boundaries, stories whose applications to current circumstances would be clear to listeners even without explicit statements. Some Persian nobles also privately expressed discomfort with Xerxes' treatment of his daughters, not because they objected to royal power and principle, but because they worried about what it meant for their own daughters who might be taken into the royal harem. If the king could use his own daughters this way, what protection did any daughter have? If family bonds meant nothing in the face of royal desire, then no woman was safe regardless of her family status or her Father's position. These concerns were expressed very carefully, usually in private conversations among trusted friends, never in writing that could be discovered, never in public forums where they might be reported to the king. But they existed, creating an undercurrent of unease about royal practices, even among the elite who generally benefited from and supported the system that granted kings absolute power. The Greeks, who recorded Persian history, were far more openly critical, though we should remember that their criticism was shaped by their own cultural biases and by their ongoing conflicts with Persia. Herodotus, writing a generation after Xerxes' death, included numerous stories about Xerxes' treatment of his daughters as evidence of Persian moral corruption and of how tyrannical power destroyed both rulers and ruled. He presented these stories to Greek audiences as cautionary tales about what happened when one man held too much power, when normal laws and customs didn't apply to rulers, when kings were treated as gods rather than as humans, subject to moral constraints. Later, Greek writers elaborated on these criticisms, sometimes exaggerating Persian practices to make them seem even more shocking, but also preserving information about real practices that might otherwise have been lost, because Persian records either didn't document these matters or were later destroyed. The Greek accounts are biased and sometimes unreliable in details, but they capture real phenomena, even if they interpret them through lenses shaped by Greek cultural values and political purposes. Now, let me tell you about the long-term consequences of Xerxes' practices, how his treatment of Crete, his daughters, influenced subsequent Persian kings, and how it contributed to patterns of royal behavior that persisted for centuries until the Persian Empire finally fell to Alexander the Great in 330 BCE. Later, Persian kings, observing how Xerxes had used his daughters, without facing significant consequences, felt emboldened to follow similar practices. The precedent had been set. Royal daughters could be claimed by their fathers and then distributed to nobles as rewards. This was now simply how royal power operated, was expected and normalized, was written into the structure of court politics and administration. But this normalization also created long-term problems for the dynasty by treating royal women as property without agency, by using daughters instrumentally, by destroying family bonds through abuse and political manipulation. The kings created conditions where loyalty within royal families became impossible. Children couldn't trust their parents. Siblings couldn't trust each other. Every relationship was potentially exploitative. Every gesture of affection might hide calculation. Every family gathering might be the prelude to elimination of rivals. This destruction of trust made succession crises more violent and more chaotic, because no one could be certain of support even from close family members. The very practices that were supposed to demonstrate royal power and bind nobles to the throne through marriages with royal daughters actually created instability by ensuring that royal women had no investment in maintaining the system that had used them, and that their children grew up in households marked by trauma and dysfunction. When Alexander the Great invaded Persia in 334 BCE, one of the factors that contributed to Persian defeat was the internal weakness of the royal family and court. The king at the first time, Darius III, couldn't fully trust his own commanders and relatives, because generations of practices like those Xerxes had established had created a court culture of paranoia and betrayal. The empire that Xerxes had ruled was wealthy and powerful, but it was also deeply dysfunctional at its core, held together by force and fear, rather than by loyalty or shared values. After Alexander's conquest, when Greek observers could examine Persian court records, and interview survivors. They recorded accounts of royal practices that shocked even those who thought they understood Persian culture. They found documentation of marriages between fathers and daughters, of daughters given as rewards to commanders, of princesses distributed as political tools. These records were studied by later historians trying to understand how great empires fell. And one common conclusion was that societies that allowed absolute power without moral constraints eventually destroyed themselves from within, even if external enemies didn't conquer them. Now, as we approach the end of this account, let me return to where we began, to Midas at age 13, being summoned to her father's chambers, experiencing that first night that would mark her for life. Because understanding the full system helps us understand the individual experiences. And understanding what happened to specific daughters helps us see that these weren't abstract practices but were violence done to real people with real feelings and real suffering. What Xerxes did to Midas that night, and on subsequent nights when he summoned her, what he did to all his daughters who reached puberty during his reign, was use their bodies for his pleasure, while telling himself and telling them that this was normal, was his right, was even sacred because he was exercising divine prerogative. He surrounded the acts with religious language about preserving royal bloodlines. He justified them through claims about his special status as King of Kings. He normalized them by doing them openly enough that the court knew, but in private spaces where details remained hidden. For Emitus and for her sisters, the experience was not sacred, or justified, or normal. It was violation by the one person who should have protected them. It was betrayal by their father. It was discovery that family bonds meant nothing in the face of power, that their bodies were not their own, that their purpose was to serve their father's pleasure and political interests, regardless of the cost to 25 themselves. Some daughters broke completely under this treatment, became withdrawn and non-functional, lived out their lives in quiet madness. Some adapted by dissociating, learning to separate their minds from their bodies during the experiences, going through motions, while their consciousness retreated to spaces where their father couldn't reach. Some eventually convinced themselves that what was happening was normal or acceptable or at least inevitable, internalizing the justifications they had been taught, reframing violation as duty or even as honor. But all of them were damaged. All of them carried scars that shaped their entire lives. All of them passed trauma to their own children, creating generational cycles of dysfunction that rippled through the bodies. Persian royal family, for decades after Xerxes died. The practices he engaged in, the system he maintained and intensified, the treatment he normalized, all of this had consequences that extended far beyond his immediate victims into the broader patterns of how power operated in Persian society. What should we make of Xerxes and his treatment of his daughters across 2,000 years of distance? How do we understand practices that seem incomprehensible to modern minds? But that made sense within ancient Persian frameworks of royal power and divine right. How do we balance historical context against recognition that some things cause harm, regardless of cultural justifications? We can acknowledge that Persian culture was different from ours, that they had different values and different understanding of family and power and proper relationships. We can recognize that judging ancient peoples by modern standards is complicated and potentially unfair. We can try to understand how Persians themselves understood these practices rather than simply imposing our values on their society. But we can also recognize that the daughters Xerxes suffered regardless of how the practices were justified. Their pain was real. Their trauma was real. Their lack of choice was real. Whatever cultural frameworks surrounded these practices, whatever religious language justified them, whatever political purposes they served, none of that changes the fact that 3-year-old girls were violated by their father and had no power to refuse or resist or escape. Modern psychology recognizes that this kind of familial abuse creates lasting damage regardless of cultural context. Children who are used this way develop complex trauma, attachment disorders, difficulty trusting, problems with self-worth, high rates of depression and anxiety, and other mental health issues. We have no reason to think ancient Persian daughters were any different, that they somehow escaped these consequences because their culture told them the abuse was normal or sacred. So we can say clearly what Xerxes did to his daughters was wrong, was harmful, was abuse of power that destroyed lives in service of his desires and his political interests. The fact that his culture tolerated or even normalized these practices doesn't make them less destructive. The fact that the frameworks justified them doesn't make them sacred. The fact that he had the power to do as he wished doesn't make his choices right. The daughters of Xerxes existed. They suffered. They tried to survive in circumstances that gave them no good options. Some survived physically and died psychologically. Some died young from violence or illness or despair. Some lived long lives, carrying trauma that never healed. They deserve to be remembered not as abstractions or as footnotes to their father's reign, but as people who experienced real harm that we can acknowledge and name even across the gulf of centuries. What do you think about Xerxes and his treatment of his daughters? How do we balance historical understanding against moral judgment? Were there any real choices available to these daughters? Or was the system so total that resistance was impossible? How should we remember rulers who caused enormous harm, but who operated within cultural frameworks that supported their actions? Leave your comments below and share your thoughts. If you found this account of Xerxes and his daughters disturbing and important, if you believe these stories need to be told so we understand how power operates without constraints, then subscribe to this channel and share this video. We explore the dark corners of history that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature and about how absolute power corrupts absolutely. The ruins of Prosopolis still stand in modern Iran, massive columns reaching toward the sky, reliefs showing Persian kings receiving tribute from subject peoples, staircases where ancient processions once marched. Tourists photograph these ruins and marvel at Persian grandeur without knowing the full stories of what happened in the palace chambers, in the women's quarters where daughters waited to be summoned by their father, in the private spaces where power was exercised, without witnesses or restraints. Remember Amitas and Artaint and Amestris, and all the other daughters whose names we know or don't know, who were born into the Persian royal family during Xerxes' reign, who experienced childhoods that ended when they reached puberty and their father claimed them. They lived in circumstances we can barely imagine, made choices from among terrible options, survived or didn't survive. Systems designed to use them without acknowledging their humanity. Their suffering documented in fragmentary sources and preserved in stories passed down across centuries stands as testimony to what happens when power faces no limits, when one person's desires trump all other considerations, when family bonds mean nothing in the face of claims to divine authority. These are not comfortable stories. They reveal aspects of human nature and human social organization that we would prefer not to confront, but they are true, or true enough, in their essentials, even if specific details are uncertain, and they matter because the dynamics they reveal. Absolute power, corrupting absolutely elites, using religious and cultural frameworks to justify practices that serve their interests. victims having no recourse or protection. Systems that normalize the unacceptable through repetition and through ideological justification. These dynamics didn't end with ancient Persia. They appear throughout history in different forms and different contexts. Understanding how they operated in the past helps us recognize them when they appear in the present. See you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring the dark realities of ancient civilizations and the ways power has always corrupted those who hold it without accountability.